A very good afternoon to everyone. I, Shraddha Tanga from Gulbarga, the moderator for today, would like to extend my warm welcome to all on behalf of Ex Gratia to the second exclusive law webinar on caste, religion, and constitution. We are extremely grateful to Swami Nirbhayananda Saraswati, Sri J. Sai Deepak Sir, and to all the participants as well as the members of Ex Gratia who have made this event possible. I would like my friend Mr. Jagannath to introduce today's opening speaker, Swami Nirbhayananda Saraswati.
Param Pujya Srimata Swami Nirbhayanand Ji Maharaj, President Sri Ramakrishna Vivekananda Ashrama, Gadag Vijayapur, is a recipient of the award Ambassador for Peace conferred by UPF, a consultative body of Economic and Social Council, an organ of United Nations. Swamiji has a distinct wish of being a speaker for Parliament of World Religious on Barcelona, Spain in 2014. Swamiji is a graduate in science. Swamiji has extensively traveled and lectured at universities of Stanford, Colorado, and Dortmund, etc., in addition to giving public talks at cities like Washington, D.C., Portland, Dallas, etc. Swamiji is a force and inspiration, being Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement at Northern Karnataka and runs schools for unprivileged at Mangoli of Bijapur district, known for its academic excellence. It is noteworthy that this institution has sheltered the children of Kargil Matos and the other district too. Swamiji was an invited speaker at the Akka Sammelana of Chicago and chaired the youth session at the International Vedic Conference held at Orlando of USA in the year 2008. It is a great privilege and honor to us that His Holiness has graced this occasion. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Jagannath. I request Swamiji to please take over the session.
Salutations at the lotus feet of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Mata Sri Sharada Devi and Swami Vivekananda. It gives me immense pleasure to be an integral part of this most beautiful and very meaningful program organized by young friends like Shashi Kumar, Sagar, Anup, Shraddha, Jagannath, and all these people. It is equally elevating for me to note that Sriman Deepak, a great name in the legal fraternity of India, who fought for the cause of Sabarimala and also for the cause of the claims of royal family on the Ananta Padmanabha temple in Indram. The subject for today's discussion is very much interesting, very much relevant, and very much consequential also. We need to know something about this subject. This is a subject that is almost in the heated discussions issuing forth from several intellectual sections of India and around. Caste system, religion, constitution, all the three are very interesting. Of course, I need not shed much light upon constitution because the associates or the organizers of this program themselves are law students. They have pursued legal profession and they are very much deeply into the Indian jurisprudence as well as perhaps the international law and so many associated topics of relevance. But caste system and religion, they need to be thoroughly churned into. Many people do not know anything about caste system, but they have that irrepressible temptation to say and comment on caste system. Remember, religion has nothing to do with caste system. It is unfortunate many people connect caste system, Indian caste system and Hindu religion together. It has no meaning at all. There are so many evils that we can come across in various races and communities of the world. There is Christianity, there is Islam, there are so many other religions, and there are certain defects that are there in these religions also. They don't like anyone to associate that defect with religion itself. Say, for example, some centuries ago, witchcraft was there in Christianity. So many women, known as witch, known for their witchcraft, were burnt alive. You can't, they say, it has nothing to do with Christianity. It was some sort of a social deviation, social aberration that existed amongst Christians during medieval times. Because it existed among Christians, you cannot associate it with Christianity itself. Christians were doing it. Christians do so many things. That doesn't mean to say all those things that Christians do have got a patronization from Christianity itself. There are so many odds, there are so many objectionable things that one can come across in Muslims. It doesn't mean to say all those aberrations have got the sanction of Quran or the Islamic religion. Similarly, caste system is a practice which appears to be objectionable in today's context, but which was never objectionable in the context pertaining to some several hundreds of centuries ago. Such a system was there, socio-economic system. That caste system is a socio-economic system. The very fact that it is a socio-economic system itself will disqualify caste system from being an integral part of the religion itself. So first and the foremost thing that we need to take note of is that caste system that was practiced by the Hindus of India has nothing to do with the religion that was practiced by the Hindus or the Hinduism. Then what is caste system? It is a sort of reservation, we can say. If today's reservation has got any relevance, any meaning, then the reservation that originated from 10,000 years ago or some 15,000 years ago also has got a relevance. If reservation in today's context is based on the birth of a man, all sorts of reservations that we are practicing in India today have got their basis on the birth of the man. Similarly, 10,000 years ago, the caste system was based on the birth of a man. Caste system of yore, caste system of ancient times, and reservation policy of today's India, today's context, have not much in difference. Almost, you can say, they are allegorical. They are allegorical. And remember, caste system was not an eternal value that was introduced into the Hindu socio-political system. It was not an eternal value. It was a temporary arrangement. This sort of an was conceived and practiced because during those times, the founding fathers of our civilization, our culture, they wanted to protect the weaker sections from cutthroat competition from the higher sections of society. Remember, every society is always phased. There is nothing like egalitarian society in the absolute sense of the term. There is no time when society is equal. It is very pleasant for us. It is very much pleasing for us to hear that all men are equal. All men are never equal. Men should love each other as though they are equals. They must treat each other as though they are equals. But strictly speaking, going by the truth of truths, men are never equal. If all are equal, then the concept of evolution will lose its meaning. What is meant by evolution? Among 750 crores of human beings today that we can see in this world, there are so many people, millions and millions of people that have assumed human birth for the first time. There are millions of people that have assumed human birth for the 100th time. There are millions of people that have assumed their human birth for, for the millionth time or a multi-millionth time. Can you equate all these people? A human being, a man or a woman that has assumed human birth for the first time cannot be equal to a man who has assumed human birth for the millionth time. Million times has taken human birth. Lot of experience he has gained. Lot of knowledge he has gained. Knowledge of education he has gained. Lot of exposures he has gained. Lots of realizations he has gained.
Hello.
He cannot be equated with a man who has become a human being for the first time. He is raw. There is that tremendous legacy. There is that tremendous pressure of legacy on him. For millions of births, he was a subhuman species. For millions of years, he was a subhuman species. For millions of years, he was a bird. He was a reptile. He was whatnot. For the first time, he is entering into the human world. Can you equate him with another person who is almost same as a Mahatma Gandhi or a Vivekananda or an Einstein? Can you equate him? Physical form appear to be one and the same. But physical forms do not constitute a man. They are just the outer sheath of a man. They are the outer garment of a man. What exactly is man? What is the real man? Real man is his inner self, his antahkarana, to put it in that Sanskrit language. The inner man. Inner man is the real man. That real man expresses himself through the outer man. This outer man is just an instrument through which that expression is taking place. It is something like a copper conductor in electric circuit. A copper conductor can only serve as the medium for the electricity to traverse, but it will never do anything that electricity does. What is important in electric circuit is electricity, not the insulation, not the conductor. They are there, they are very much required. They are necessary, no doubt, but they are not sufficient. The necessary and the sufficient requirement in electrical circuit is electricity itself and nothing else. That is the inner stuff of what is called as electric circuit. Similarly, in a the compounded entity that we call as human being, what is really important is the psycho spiritual being that is inside, the psycho spiritual man that is inside, and not the physical being that is outside, the psycho-social being or the psycho-spiritual being inside, that is more important. So, the psycho-spiritual being is a summation of all his faculties, all his abilities, his weaknesses, etc. The aggregate of his abilities, his weaknesses, his faculties, his efficiency, and all the abilities that one can identify oneself with, these things can be counted as the real man. And therefore, obviously there is so much of difference of level in the abilities of man in any society at any time. Therefore, there is a strong man, there is a weak man. There are stronger sections, there are weaker sections, and there is a middle section. If there is no any sort of a discipline, if society is made free, if people are given all the freedom to pursue whatever they want, the lowest section of society will go to the dogs, because faculty wise they are at the lowest ebb, they are at the lowest level. They can't do anything. Clerical job they can't do, police job they can't do, because everything will be usurped by the creamy layers in society. The higher sections of society, the upper middle class, the middle class will snatch away everything. And what should happen to the lower middle class? What should happen to the lower classes and lower middle classes? They will go to the dogs. What should happen? Therefore, the founding fathers of our culture, society, they made this pursue only into the family into which you are born. Whatever your father has been doing, you can't have any quarrel in that. We didn't make you born there. You have been born there. It has been your own choice. your previous karma, your previous actions, your previous thoughts, your previous merits, your previous demerits, your sins, your action, your merits, and all these things have enabled you to take your birth in a particular family, in a particular womb of a mother, which alone has given you the caste that presently you belong to. There is a profession that is attached to this family, and that is the profession you have to pursue. It has been your own choice. If birth has been your own choice, then caste also has been your own choice. If caste has been your own choice, then profession also has been your own choice. Therefore, a carpenter's son is protected, a blacksmith's son is protected, a goldsmith's son is protected. All these profitable professions would have been usurped, would have been snatched away by stronger sections of society if caste system were not there. Because caste system did exist, people had both ends met. They had their bread earned. They had their survival. They could thrive. They could survive. They could live. And in and through that particular caste only, they could pursue excellence and they could reach to any level of excellence they want, thereby commanding a social glory, a social position, a social standing, etc., etc. If we go by the caste structure, a Brahmana has got his own merits and demerits. A Brahmana has got highest respect, not an iota of luxury associated with his profession, with his caste. Respect will not fill your belly. If people salute you, it will not give you bread. If people offer their salutations, that will not give you clothing. That will not feed his wife and children. See how much of suffering he had, how much of deprivation he had. Poverty was an integral part of a Brahminical system. No Brahmana has ever been found to be a rich man. It is only after the British came that Brahmins have been found to be a little bit well-to-do. Till then, they never had been known for their richness. Richness always associated with itself with the Vaishya section. Brahmins had their own advantages and disadvantages. Kings to the Kshatriyas, no doubt they had all the command, all the power in their hand, but their life was extremely risky. Any moment they had to be on their toes to fight against the enemy and be prepared for losing their life. What should happen to their wife and children? What must happen to their kith and kin? What must happen to their dependents and all that? If Brahmana suffered from poverty, acute poverty, the king, the Kshatriya, always suffered the uncertainty factor, uncertainty in the security in his life. And what about Vaishya? He had to go out on seas. He had to go out on trade. Hardly he could find any free time with his wife and children. Always he had to be on his toes. He had to move along. And business used to be always risky. Not only business of today is very risky, business of any day is very risky. And major part of his earnings will go in the form of tax to the king. How much he is left with? And there is always that constant threat from the thieves, the robbers, etc., etc., the wayside robbers, etc., etc. So this risk is very much always associated with his profession. And the Shudra always will complain that he neither has any respect nor any power to command, nor any richness, any of such things. Shudra used to complain, but his life was very secure. He had no risk at all. There was neither any business risk, nor there was any life risk. There was no poverty. There was no discipline. There was no strict social discipline levied upon a Shudra. If Brahmin boy is dead, if a Brahmana is dead, his wife will become widow. She will shave her head. She will make herself an ugly woman. She has to observe all the rituals very strictly. This life of a sannyasi she has to lead. She cannot go out and take part in any social programs as freely as her counterparts belonging to other caste would do, because she had to maintain that strict, austere rules and laws that were being levied on her. And Kshatriya, when a Kshatriya is dead, his wife had to fling herself into the funeral pyre. She had to jump into that system was there during Rajput's period, right from Sati days. Shiva's wife Sati, Dakshayani, she was also called as Dakshayani. When Shiva was insulted by her own father in the royal court, she flung herself into the fire. Her name was Sati. From that, the system came to be called as Sati system. Only Brahmana widows had to ugly themselves. Kshatriya widows had to jump into the fire. This rule was not applicable for Vaishya. For Vaishyas and Shudras, social rules were not that strict. Rules were very liberal. There was no Ekadashi. There was nothing like they had to perform puja of God before they consume any food. They had to take their bath several times a day. All those strict disciplines were levied on Brahmana and Kshatriya. They were not so much strict for Vaishya and Shudra. More the discipline, more rigorous the life is, more respect you have got. So, if one is losing one thing, he is gaining something. That is the reason, remember, people may raise so much hue and cry today. Caste system in India has been there for the past more than 20 to 30,000 years. Have we ever seen one single clash that has ensued among people of different castes? Brahmanas being fought against by Kshatriyas and Kshatriyas are being fought against by Vaishyas. Vaishyas are being fought against by Shudras. People belonging to different castes fighting among themselves. Social revolutions, social uprisings like the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, etc., that we see in Italy, France, Russia, etc. Do we see any such thing in India? There has never been one social uprising in India through history. Not one single social disturbance, even though for the past 20,000 years we have been observing it. You know why? People understood that the respected people had to lead the life of a tapasvi. We cannot lead the life of a tapasvi, and therefore we can't claim any respect. We are not respected because we are not tapasvis. They are so much respected because they are tapasvis. Well, they are doing tapasvi and therefore they are respected. Saintliness is the ideal of Indian society. Any person who is nearest to that saintly life is always highest respected. He is highly respected. Brahmana used to be at the nearest point of saintly life, and therefore he was respected high, was respected most. Kshatriya had to risk his life. He had to die, he had to be ready to die anytime. War would anytime ensue. Enemy may anytime attack. Any moment. He had to be prepared. Therefore, highest society of those times. All these things. A chance for anybody to change himself from one caste to any caste that he wants. This flexibility was always there. Several thousands of such examples are there in Mahabharata and Ramayana. People had all the freedom, but they had to fulfill the requirements of the caste into which they are climbing the entrance. Vishwamitra was a Bharan Kshatriya, went on doing rigorous tapasya, and he was declared a Brahmana. Parashurama was a Dwaran Brahmana. He wanted to be a warrior because he wanted to take revenge of the death of his father, who was killed by a Kshatriya, Kaushika, who later became Vishwamitra. Kartavirya Arjuna. Kartavirya Arjuna killed Jamadagni, Parashurama's father. Jamadagni wanted to take revenge, and therefore, though Parashurama was a Brahmana, he wanted to take upon himself the caste restrictions or the caste structures of a Kshatriya, which he took upon himself and declared himself a Kshatriya, and he did kill Kartavirya Arjuna. A Bharan Brahmana converted himself into Kshatriya. Several such examples are there. Only two notable examples I have quoted before you. Several such are there. Therefore, caste system was never a rigid one. Religion has nothing to do with that. Just as today's constitution is flexible, it is open for amendment. Manusmriti, constitution of those times, was also any day open for reformation or amendment. So much hue and cry is raised against Manusmriti today in TV discussions, in newspaper articles. The ignorant people know nothing about Manusmriti. Hindu social structures and Hindu religious structures, they raise all complaints against Manusmriti and that which is totally baseless and which is totally meaningless. Manu himself will say, Anniye krutayugendrunam, tretayam dvapare apare, Anniye kaliyugendrunam, yugahrasa. Sorry, Anniye krutayuge dharmaha, Anniye krutayuge dharmaha, tretayam dvapare apare, Anniye kaliyugendrunam, yugahrasa anurupataha. Manu says, so those laws that I have enshrined for Kruta Yuga will not apply for Treta Yuga, Dwapara and Kali Yuga. Only certain laws are applicable for Kruta Yuga. Only certain sections of laws are applicable for Treta Yuga. Only certain sections of laws are applicable for Dwapara Yuga. What is applicable for Dwapara Yuga may not be applicable for Treta Yuga and vice versa. What is applicable for Kruta Yuga may not be applicable for Dwapara Yuga and vice versa. Anye Kruta Yuga dharmaha, Tretayam Dwapare apare, Anye Kaliyuge nruna, Yugahrasa anurupadaha. Depending upon the need of the society, depending upon the need of the hour, my laws can be changed. Manu himself has said that. When he has said that, if you come across certain injunctions in Manusmriti like Nastri Swatantram arhasi, a woman does not deserve any right at all. Such things we come across. Women of what times? And what sort of a women? Is it every woman? If Manu said women don't deserve any respect at all, any freedom at all, they don't deserve any freedom at all, then why would he say, Yatra naryasta pujyante ramante tatra devata? Here also the subject matter is Nari. There also subject matter is Nari. At one point he says, wherever women are worshipped, the angels will dance in joy. Where women are worshipped, angels will dance in joy. At other place he has said, women don't deserve freedom. Then what does he mean? There are certain type of women that do not deserve freedom. Certain type of women don't deserve women for freedom. There are certain other types of women who, whenever they are worshipped, wherever they are worshipped, then angels will dance in joy. This is common sense. Today's critics, they lack even this bit of common sense. How many hundreds of times we see college professors, we see the so-called Matadipatis also, we see so-called social champions denouncing Manu just because he has denied the women sections of Indian society their legitimate freedom. Where has he denied? It is all prejudices. It is all sheer nonsense. It is utter nonsense. It is a prejudice. And remember, the worst enemy of any science is prejudice. A prejudiced mind cannot have scientific temperament in that, and therefore it is a trash. It is totally absurd. So my time is up. I have totally dedicated my attention on the caste system, which is of a very burning issue in today's context. Constitution, of course, I did not find time. And today's constitution, I find an objection about which I make a mention and conclude my talk. Today there is what is called as minority concept, which is totally meaningless. Totally meaningless. All minorities, they are not minorities, they are the ruling sections. Every section of Indian society today that is enjoying the privileges of minority, they were not minorities, they have ruled India. It is majority that has suffered. The majority Hindus have suffered. All the so-called minorities, every minority without a single exception has ruled India. Which minority has not ruled India? They were the ruling sections, and again we are giving them undue privileges at the cost of the majority, the Hindus, who were ruled by the minorities themselves during the previous days. What sort of a meaningless, baseless concept this constitution has got? Has anyone observed this? This is something that we have to eliminate, divest of our constitution of this malady. It is an utter malady which constitution deserves to be totally eliminated of. Totally, we have to get rid of our constitution of this, what I should say, a very objectionable portion that is called as the minority concept. The future lawyers of India, our young friends, like our Shashikumara, our Sagar, Anup, Jagannath, Shraddha, the tomorrow's the legal fraternity, the constitutional experts. These people are going to be the future Palkhivaras and all that, who should definitely come forward with all the amendment and the rectification that is required in this regard. I thank the organizers for having given me this opportunity. I wish you all the best in all your future ventures. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Swamiji, for sharing so much wisdom and knowledge at this platform with all of us. You're kind to indulge our inquisitive mind today. I would
Thank
like
you.
my friend Miss Amrita to introduce today's speaker of the day, Shri Jai Sai Deepak Sir.
Good evening, everyone. I, Ms. Amrita Niranjan, on behalf of Ex Gracia team, would like to introduce our today's guest and a great personality, Shri J. Sai Deepak Sir. Sir is an engineer turned law firm partner turned arguing counsel. Sir has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Anna University from 2002 to 2006 and a bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur from 2006 to 2009. Sir has been a litigator since July 2009 and was an associate partner at a leading national capital region based litigation firm, Sai Krishna and Associates, until he went independent in June 2016. In June 2016, Sir has founded law chambers of J. Sai Deepak and set up practice as an arguing counsel. Apart from the clients who have retained, Sir is engaged by soliciting law firms and individual solicitors to appear before the Supreme Court of India, the Delhi High Court, the Madras High Court, the Competition Commission of India, NCLAT, and Intellectual Property Appellate Board. Sir has a full-time 3 members team of associates to handle clients who have retained his chambers and to assist him in the matters where he is engaged as arguing counsel. In over a decade's practice, Sir has carved a niche for himself in civil commercial litigation, IP litigation, information technology law, competition law, constitutional law, and indirect taxation. Sir has advised, represented, and argued for clients in diverse domains such as pharmaceutical industry, e-commerce, and the telecom sectors. In July 2018, Sir argued on behalf of the ready-to-wait women campaigners in Varivala Ayyappa temple petition before a constitutional bench of Supreme Court were widely reported by the national media and represented himself in Padmanabha Swami temple verdict in July 2020. Sir has represented and argued in several cases like Tata Sons versus Greenpeace in 2011 and been representing prominent Indian mobile brands against Ericsson in ongoing standards essential patent litigation in 2013. In August 2019, Sir was among the 19 alumni of IIT Kharagpur who were awarded Young Alumni Achievers Award. We are happy to welcome you, sir. On behalf of Ex Gracia team, I would like to welcome you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita. I request Deepak Sir to please take over the session.
Namaste. I would first of all like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share space with Pujya Swamiji Puneet Maharaj Ji of Ramakrishna Mission, and for giving me an opportunity to share my humble views on this important and relevant topic. I was hoping to contribute whatever little I know of this particular topic, but after having heard Swamiji, I don't know if I have enough to share or if whatever I have to share is of any value. But whatever little I know, I will place it at Swamiji's feet and I will share it to the audience. And I hope it is of some use to your understanding to the entire issue. In fact, one of the things that I proposed during the course of Swamiji's lecture was if Swamiji gives me an opportunity, I would like to interact with him for the benefit of the audience on certain questions so that members of the audience benefit from the interaction, subject to Swamiji's permission, of course. Swamiji, am I audible? I think Swamiji is on mute.
1 second, sir.
Swamiji, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, please.
So, given that anything that I present on caste and religion with respect to the Constitution is incomplete without your expert knowledge on the first two subjects, caste and religion, for the sake of my own clarity and understanding and for the benefit of the audience, may I share some of my doubts which can perhaps benefit my knowledge as well as the knowledge of the members of the audience, Swamiji? May I do that?
Sure.
Please. Swamiji, Article 26 of the Indian Constitution uses the word religious denomination, and that particular provision of the Constitution is applicable to Hindus, Muslims, Christians across the board. Unfortunately, the word religious denomination has a specific Abrahamic connotation, the way it is understood. I just wanted to understand, Swamiji,
Yes.
would Sampradaya be a better translation for religious denomination from a Hindu perspective?
Yeah, religion as it is understood in Abrahamic concept is, you can say, Sampradaya, in fact, the synonym or the paryaya pada for Sampradaya will be tradition rather than religion. Tradition and Sampradaya, they can be on two pans of a balance. But religion itself, you can say, religious practice, what we call as religious practice in India is religion for the Westerners, for the Semitic people. But whenever we use the word religion in Indian context, the term that we take, the term that we rely upon, we make use of is dharma. Dharma. What we call as dharma, the Abrahamic background people will find it equivalent to religion. But their religion and our dharma are not one and the same. Dharma here is a lifestyle, is culture. Dharma has got varnashrama, jati paddhati and all that. Not religion of India. Not the religious pursuit of India. Religion, in fact, should have been termed as religious pursuit. The collective religious pursuits of Indian people is Indian religion. Collective religious pursuits. For example, it is sort of a confederation of various sects. Religion in India, strictly speaking, is a confederation of various religious sects, panthas, Shaivites, Vaishnavites, Advaitins, Vishishtadvaitins, Dvaitins, Shaktas, Ganapatyas, Panchayatana. Shanmata Shankaracharya is called as Shanmata Sthapanacharya. Hundreds and hundreds of sects were there. They all were an integral part of Hinduism only. Of course, during those times, it was Sanatana Dharma. It is only after Greeks started coming into India that we came to be called as Indians, and earlier to that, Persians called as Hindus and all that. But going by the traditions of India, the Sanatana Dharma has hundreds and thousands of religious pursuits, panthas. They were collectively, the aggregate of all those things came to be called as Hindu Dharma. Hindu Dharma is never a unified code. It is never a unified stream. It is always a collection, so much fused into each other that there never had been any sort of a clash among any two religious people of religious pursuits. So that is how, yeah, please.
You mentioned Sampradaya. Now, one of the
Ah,
things that we have been trying to present before the Supreme Court, including in the Sabarimala matter and in other similarly situated matter, is to try and explain to the court that every temple has its own paddhati, which is governed by or which is informed by either the Sthala Purana or which is informed by its customs, and that
yes.
acquires the status of a sampradaya or an achara, rising to the level of tradition, as you rightly put it.
Hmm.
I just wanted to understand, Swamiji, from a dharmic perspective and from your perspective, what would be the paribhasha or the definition for sampradaya according to you? When does something attain the status of sampradaya? When does it become tradition? Is it time? What governs that particular definition?
Yeah. It is through the generations, and the generations that follow a particular sampradaya, they have very willingly accepted that, they have been benefited by that, they have clung fast to that, they don't want to divest themselves of it unless they are forced to do so. So sampradaya is an accepted norm of a religious pursuit. It is an authenticated, officialized, practiced, entrenched, retrenched, rooted, totally accepted, and rendered an integral part of the religious instinct of that particular section. So sampradaya almost is equal as religion only.
Great.
It is as fast. People have clung to that as fast as they would do with their religion. So religion is an abstract term. Yeah, please.
Would it be fair to state that for followers of a sampradaya, their immediate dharma is the the observation of the sampradayam itself? Their primary dharma and their immediate dharma would be the observation of that particular sampradaya itself.
Sure.
Is there any who is the person, the right person, or the authority to recognize a particular sampradaya for a particular group or an institution? Who decides what is the sampradaya and what are the rules of a sampradaya, Swamiji?
Actually, basically and fundamentally, that authority was vested with the four Shankaracharyas of India. Till Buddhism came, we never knew what is meant by an organized religion. The religion of India was imparted the color and the status of an organization for the first time in history only by Buddha and the followers of Buddha. Buddhism became an organized religion. There was a central authority and branches and heads at nodal points, collective leadership and the apex point and the supreme leadership and all that. So Buddha imparted the status of an organization to the otherwise a sort of free-flowing religion in India. After Buddhism got itself driven out of India, it was vested with the responsibility of the four Shankar Mats established by Shankaracharya in four corners. But after 500 years or so, certain sections wanted to break off from the Shankara tradition. Sri Ramanujacharya came, Madhvacharya came, and one Hindu, strong, united, central core got split off into several. Again, several sections came, several sects came. Each sect had its own highest authority and all that. For example, for this Dvaita Sampradaya, there is Udupi, there is Mayavati, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Mayavati in the north, with the Puri Jagannath temple as its practicing point. Here in south, it is Udupi, Krishna temple is there. For Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya, Andavan Swamigal and all that, they have their own. There are North Indian Sri Vaishnava centers that are heads for people belonging to that particular sect. But even now, to a very major extent, the authority, as far as the tradition is concerned, rests with the Shankaracharyas only. That is why in the Kumbh Mela and all such national level festivals, where lots of people will gather, people from all sections, all sects, all sampradayas, all traditions, they come and pour in to confluence at a particular point. the inauguration will be always done by any of the four Shankaracharyas and all that. Of course, even that hold is becoming a bit loosened with spread of religion, and people they are not accepting anyone as authority. They want to go by their own conscience. Well, as long as they go by their own conscience, as long as the moral fiber of a man is not adversely affected, there is nothing wrong in that. Therefore, we can say in and through this democratic spirit in the religion of India, there is a bit of authority, but democratic spirit reigns always more. It reigns more supreme than subscribing oneself to any one particular central authority. It is more of a democratic nature as far as Indian traditional religious pursuits are concerned. You cannot pinpoint any one particular point, but you can say for all practical purposes, the four Shankaracharyas of India.
Swamiji, you mentioned that the four Shankaracharyas effectively were treated as authority, but this was a post-Buddhist development, so to speak, and largely as a response to the organized structure of the Buddhist panth, so to speak, or the sect. So then the question that I have is, from a historical standpoint, what was the concept of authority prior to Buddhism and prior to the establishment of the four Shankarapithas across the country? How was the structure followed then?
You can say if prior to Buddhism, there is what is called as the darkest religious period in Indian history. From Mahabharata war up to Buddha, we cannot see any sort of an organized religion. We don't see any well-defined Indian history at all, be it religious history, social history, political history, or whatever history. History is not well-defined at all. It was the darkest period for the reason all the well-meaning people, all the people of abilities, people of faculties, people that could command some standing in Indian society, they were totally absent after Mahabharata war. Shri Krishna totally swept off the then civilizations of the world in this Mahabharata war. Almost the whole of human civilization was swept off. What were left behind were only mediocres, the good for nothings. They could not do anything. They were just amorphous sort of people. They could not establish, they were not assertive. They could not assert their identity in any sense of the term. And therefore, you can say there was no authority at all. During Mahabharata times, of course, there was Vyasa. There used to be a large host of the tapasvis whose words did carry a lot of meaning, respect, reverence, and all that. And even though they were not as many as one can imagine, through the rulers of India of those times, the saints and seers of India, the servants of India, they could act through the kings and straighten the deviations that one could come across from the social practices, etc., that one could observe during those times. So kings themselves were the authorities. Through the authority of the king, the saints like Vyasa, etc., they used to act. Through Bhishmacharya, Vyasa was acting. Sandipani was acting through Krishna. There were so many rishis, and their disciples were there as kings. And through their disciples, etc., these rishis were enforcing strict laws on society, not only social laws, even religious laws. That is how both religion and society were in perfect discipline during those times.
So would it be fair to state, Swamiji, that the rulers in that particular period effectively saw themselves as enforcers of dharma as laid down by the rishis and by their gurus?
Not all rulers. Not all rulers, definitely. You are right in observing this. Jarasandha never bothered. Right. Why? During Rigvedic period itself. In Rigveda, Vishnu Purana, we come across a beautiful episode. During Kruta Yuga days, even during Treta Yuga days, there was a beautiful arrangement. Hundreds and thousands of rishis used to be there. Hundreds and thousands of rishis used to be there. And there was a central council of rishis. Once in 3 years, once in a year, once in 5 years, the council of rishis will all assemble in one point. They will make laws, social laws. And those laws came to be as the constitutions of the kings later times. The council of rishis, they used to make laws and they used to invite all the kings for the council meetings. And the meetings used to last for about a week, etc., etc. Yajna, yaga, and all those things used to be there. They were huge yajnas. They were huge celebrations. At the end of the celebration, the rishis will come out with all the conceived laws meant for the good of the society, for the good of the society, for the welfare of the society. And kings would be given this set of laws. All kings had to accept this code of law. They had to go back to their places and implement very strictly. One king rejected to come. He did not come at all. The council of the rishis forced him to come. When all kings of Aryavarta have come, why not you? It was a commandment from rishis. During those times, even the emperors had to totally abide by the commands of the rishis. Kartivirya finally came. Unwillingly, reluctantly he came. He came all right, but he did not agree to accept the code of discipline, code of conduct that was given to him for the implementation in his kingdom by these rishis. There ensued conflict between the council head Jamadagni Maharshi and Kartivirya. And in that conflict, Jamadagni was killed by Kartivirya. Parashurama became very much enraged, did tapasya later, got all the weapons that he wanted. And not only he killed Kartivirya, he killed all the Kshatriyas of India during those times. When this process came to a conclusion, then Rama came to again revive the race of the Kshatriyas, because Kshatriyas had lost all their morale. He wanted to boost their morale again. Therefore, not only Rama emerged as the greatest of the heroes, greatest of the kings, he also emerged as greatest of the Dharma Purushas of India. Ramo Vigrahavan Dharmaha. Rama became so much Dharmika Purusha only to please the saints and sages of those times who were extremely angry with the whole of the Kshatriya race. Rama, being a Kshatriya, he lived up to the highest ideal, whereby even saints and sages started respecting him. Oh, if this is the sort of the Kshatriyas that India is going to witness from now onwards, then we, the saints and sages, our responsibility is not that much heavy. We can give back these kings all the reigns, all the king authorities that we have snatched away from them. So saying, Parashurama gave back all the reigns again to the kings. That is how again a balance came to be stricken between the Kshatriya responsibility of ruling the kingdom and the Brahmanical responsibility of always overseeing the righteousness in the society in which they were living. So such arrangements used to be there, but it lasted up to Krishna's period, and in the Mahabharata war, all these arrangements came to be almost neutralized. There became almost in neutral India. India lost all its social arrangements, political arrangements. Every institution had lost itself. There was to be totally a new age. Krishna did this intentionally, purposefully. A new age was to come, and the champion of the Dharma was no more an Avatar Purusha. The champion of the Dharma was a sannyasi from Mahabharata war onwards. Buddha was a sannyasi, Shankaracharya was a sannyasi, Allama Prabhu was a sannyasi, Tukaram was a sannyasi, all acharyas were sannyasis, Ramakrishna was a sannyasi, and recent most example, Vivekananda is the greatest of the sannyasis. And that is how a rearrangement has been infused into the socio-religious system of India.
Swamiji, in fact, your answers are giving rise to more questions in my head because I'm excited to hear everything that you have shared. May I take the liberty of asking a few more questions, Swamiji? May I take the liberty of asking a few more questions, Swamiji?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Because we are unfortunate that we understand knowledge in English, and we are very fortunate that you're able to convey in a language that we are able to understand. So for the benefit of the audience, I'm going to ask a few more questions.
Yeah.
The word caste is used in English, but I want to reject that concept for a moment and simply understand from you, as someone who has no knowledge at all, how do you distinguish between Kula, Jati and Varna?
Kula, remember, Kula has got a cultural connotation, while Jati has got a professional connotation. Varna has got, again, spiritual connotation. Varna is totally spiritual. If you are not interested,
then according to you.
if you are not interested in spiritual elevation, then Varna will not be very much relevant at all in your life.
Okay.
For one particular Varna, there is one particular spiritual discipline. That is why Krishna did not allow Arjuna to go to Himalayas and do meditation, because he was a Kshatriya.
Okay.
The spirituality for a Kshatriya was to always be a selfless personality and always champion the righteous cause. Righteous cause was to be championed. People that deviated from righteousness had to be slain. The norms of righteousness had to be upheld at any cost, which Rama did exactly. Rama never cared even to desert his own wife. Everything for the sake of just one thing. That was, he wanted to be an ideal king. An ideal king. So, for a Kshatriya, for all Hindus, be it a Brahmana or Kshatriya or Vaishya or Shudra, Varna enjoins certain duties. For preserving that duty, for maintaining the purity, commitment to that duty, one should be prepared to sacrifice one's own wife, children, mother, father, everyone.
I see.
So Varna has got a spiritual connotation, and Kula has got, as I said, a cultural connotation, and Jati has got a professional connotation. I think Jati became very much relevant, very much, mandatory for the people of India when there was a sort of dearth for public schools where all faculties were taught. We exactly don't know when it must have happened. There must have been a time in Indian history when either admission into the established schools was not allowed for all and sundry.
Okay.
Because of the so many restrictions. If number of students will increase, then teacher will not be in a position to pay attention to all the students, and he won't be in a position to do justice. And during those times, remember, India, all through its history, has always been extremely committed to quality and not to the quantity. It doesn't allow everyone to become a doctor. It doesn't allow everyone to become a saint. It doesn't allow everyone to be a king. It doesn't allow everyone even to marry. Even to marry, remember, marriage is a social institution. It is not the personal whims of any individual in India. It is elders that must be in the forefront in the marriage, and not the son and the daughter. Because if son or daughter, if they want to marry any person that they want, then tomorrow a Veerappan will be born in their womb, and that Veerappan will be a threat for the whole India. Just because of the mistake of one boy and one girl, the whole country will suffer. The children of a family will have far-reaching consequences. Every man that is born in India, today there is so much agitation that non-citizens of India should leave this land. Why? The presence of a man who is not a citizen of India on Indian soil has got a consequence. Right. And if such people are in millions and millions, the country will go to the dogs. It makes lots of sense. And therefore, if every person is consequential for a country, for a society, then what sort of person he should be, who is going to be born on the soil of this particular country, is an issue that pertains the interests of all and sundry. Society has got a right to decide what sort of people it must have as its components. So therefore, a boy and girl cannot simply decide what sort of a daughter, what sort of a son they want to have. If they cannot decide what sort of a son or what sort of a daughter they want to have, then they also cannot decide what sort of a marriage they want to have. A girl cannot decide what sort of a boy exclusively. Independently, she cannot decide. Of course, she has a say. She too has got a say. But she is not the only person that has got a say in that. Parents have a say, elders have a say. Parents have a say, elders have a say. So therefore, we are committed to the quality everywhere, quality of man, marriage, quality of marriage. The day quality of marriage became diluted, all sorts of mediocre started taking their birth in this country. As long as marriage was a strict process, there used to be quality people in this country. When marriage became an issue of whims and fancy of individuals, then everywhere human animals are being born. It is a different thing. So, being committed to quality, teacher wanted to restrict the number of students in a Gurukula. Therefore, all students cannot have claim. Preference was given to Brahmana and Kshatriya because they acted like the visionaries and the executives. Almost the whole power, the law was in their hand. The economic policies, the socio-economic policies, educational policies, foreign policies, defense policies, the total administration, and the consultants for this administration. They always definitely mattered more than anyone else. All were simply people that were implemented upon with these laws and all that. And therefore, if all cannot be given admission into the school, then a scale of preference will have to be followed. A parameter has to be followed. Parameter was being followed. And during those times, Vaishyas and Shudras perhaps were denied entrance into the Gurukula for those times. It was for them mainly the caste, the Kula, mainly the caste. Caste became very much rigid only for them. They had to follow their own caste. They could not leave their caste because their education was limited to their caste education. Their education was a caste education. They had no education in either faculty. Kshatriya field, they had no education. Brahmanical fields, they had no education. They had their education. Therefore, they had to confine themselves. While a Brahmana perhaps and a Kshatriya perhaps could experiment in the fields other than his own, while the Vaishya and Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra could not experiment or could not lay his land in the fields pertaining to the top two, the Brahmana and the Kshatriya. For them, the caste education was very much strict and very much. In fact, in Ramayana, we come across Shudraka being punished by Rama. Shudraka was a Shudra, and many people don't know he was a spy. He was a spy from Lankapatna. That is why Rama killed. Rama was not a fool to kill a man on the advice of Tom, Dick, and Harry. In fact, the person that advised Rama to kill this Shudraka was himself a great tapasvi. He was not an ordinary man. Even though a tapasvi advised Rama to kill Shudraka, Rama did not act without giving much thought to it. He probed into the background of Shudraka, who that Shudraka was. Later, they found out he was Shurpanakha's son of Shurpanakha, spying to totally destroy the administrative machinery of Ayodhya and Ayodhya itself. Rama sensed this. He wanted to nip it off in the bud itself, and therefore he was killed. In those times, a Shudra, when he gave up the duties pertaining to his own caste and entered into, or encroached rather, into the field of some other caste, then he was punishable, liable for punishment, which Rama did scrupulously. So like that, the caste rigidity applied more to the lower caste and not to the higher caste. Kula, you made a mention about, it's more pertinent to the culture. Varna is again something more or less caste only, but more of spiritual, and it belongs to the Shruti part, and caste belongs to the Smruti part. Caste definitions can change. Today's India, it can change its caste definition. It can change its caste definition. But Varna definition, no one can ever change. The four Varnas and four Ashramas will ever remain. Everywhere, even in England, there are students. Even in England, there are householders. Even in England, there are retired people. In England, there may not be sannyasis. There are brahmacharis, there are grihasthas, there are vanaprasthas. Sannyasis may not be there in England. Everywhere, ashrama system is there. Everywhere, varna system is also there. Only caste may not be there. Therefore, caste is smruti, subject to changes from time to time. While varna is shruti, it is eternal and cannot be changed. We can change its name, but we can't change its structure.
Then Swamiji, for the contemporary times that we live in, would you believe that I understand that Varnashrama Dharma continues to be relevant, but Jati Dharma, is it relevant? And birth-based Jati definitions, would you believe, continue to be relevant?
Now Jati has gone. Totally Jati has gone. The day British came, the day Brahmana started entering into the public administration, the day Kshatriyas, the British came and abolished all, the princely states of India. When they abolished all that, when princes lost all their kingly authorities and all that, when Vaishyas started entering into other professions, and when Shudras started entering into so many professions, giving up tilling of their lands, etc., etc., Jati has gone, caste system has gone. Today there is no more any caste system in India. It is not there. Remember, if there is any agency in India today which is patronizing caste system, it is Indian government and Indian state governments. Why do they want? Why do they want to base all governmental benefits based on the birth of a man? They are basing all their benefits on the caste of a man. On the one hand, benefits are based on the caste, and on the other hand, they say caste system should go. You are getting a benefit based on your own caste. Why do you want to lose your caste? I am a student. I am a layman. I am a public servant. I am getting so many promotions based on my caste. Why should I want to lose my caste? You give me benefits based on my caste, and on the other hand, you ask me to lose my caste. Today's government, it is totally, I don't know what sort of term I have to use. Again, this is the constitutional observed. Constitution of India has got so many loopholes, very terrible loopholes. Bhayanaka in Kannada we say. Tremendous loopholes. All this nonsense in the constitution has to be washed off. So it is government that is practicing the caste system, and in Indian society, Hindu society is no more practicing any caste system.
Then Swamiji, what is the future of the Hindu society if Jati Dharma has gone according to you?
Yeah, no problem at all. Hindu society, remember, as long as people are interested in evolution, as long as people are interested in accelerating their evolution, then 4 yogas will be very much relevant. If yogas are relevant, Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita will become relevant. If they are relevant, Vedas will be relevant. Vedas are relevant, Prasthanatraya is relevant, Puranas are relevant, Darshanas are relevant. What will happen to Hinduism? In today's America, 28% of Americans, they are following Hindu practices. I have a newspaper article with me that appeared in an American newspaper in 2008. What is her name? Miller. Elsa Miller. She has written that article. You know what is the caption of that article? We are all Hindus now. We are all Hindus now is the caption. In that, she gives a narrative where this one particular point becomes very much clear. 28% American citizens are following Hinduism. They have only not declared themselves as Hindus. That is all. So Hinduism spreading far and wide. Today, 25 lakh Russians have become Hindus. 20 years ago, not a single person was a Hindu. Today, 25 lakh people, more than 1% of Russians, they are Hindus. And I have gone to Europe 5 times. I have found out 75% of Europeans, they have left Christianity. They are not following Christianity. Half of them, they are in search of a good religion. The remaining half of them, they are following Yoga, Vedanta, and Buddhism. 50 years from now, 75% of Europeans will have totally given up Christianity, and they will have accepted or embraced some other religion, and that some other religion is none other than either Hinduism or Buddhism. I am not unduly optimistic if I say next 100 years, almost half Europe and half America will have become Hindus.
Swamiji, one question I have.
Yeah.
Given the challenges that our civilization is currently facing, and challenges from several radical forms of several mindsets without necessarily naming anyone, Don't you think our society is still supposed to worship qualities such as Kshatriya Dharma? And how shall we invoke, or how do we give birth to Kshatriya Dharma without actually following the rules that apply to a Kshatriya code of conduct? How do we hope to generate that once more? How do you hope to do that?
The easiest way of doing it is studying Swami Vivekananda. The true Kshatriya that India was able to project out after Shivaji and Guru Gobind Singh. After Muslims came to India, the one field that was worst affected, more affected than any other field in this country adversely, was the Kshatriya field. Our morale was destroyed at every step. Muslims took every opportunity to totally destroy the morale of the Hindus. British also did that in an indirect way, in a civilized way. But Muslims did it straight away. And it very much adversely affected. But in and through all this, remember, we got adversely affected only for the past 500 years or 1000 years. But our Kshatriya has been intact for the past more than 50,000 years. India is known both as much for Kshatriya as for the saintliness and the philosophical bent of mind. If one once go through, Chakravarti Rajagopalachari says, Vivekananda saved Hinduism and saved India. But for him, we would not have this independence of India came, religion of India remained with Indians or Hindus through Vivekananda, because people went through Vivekananda's works and they got themselves totally rejuvenated, inspired. The governor of Bengal,
Swamiji, you're not audible. I'm so sorry.
when Lord Curzon was the Viceroy of India, am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, Swamiji.
When Lord Curzon was Viceroy, he took the drastic step of dividing Bengal, and Bengal partition also took place. That gave rise to tremendous national spirit to have its rise in every corner of the country, with Bengal as the starting point. Within 10 years, the British started shaking. They were terribly disturbed. The governor of Bengal sends a secret report to the Secretary of State in England, and that secret report says it is shocking to note. It is shocking to note that hundreds and thousands of young men, without a trace of concern for their future, without bothering about the consequences of what they are doing, they are coming out of their homes and hearts, stretching their chests against the bullets of British, with Vande Mataram on their lips and words of Vivekananda in their heart. See, hundreds and thousands of people within 5 years of Vivekananda's giving this rousing call to Indians to arise and awake. The whole India got up. There came Bhagat Singh, there came Subhash Chandra Bose, there came Savarkar, hundreds and hundreds of Bengal revolutionaries came. And what sort of work was done, in India Society in London by Savarkar and all those. It's unfortunate. People don't know about Savarkar. How many young men who had gone to England for studying ICS, they threw away everything without bothering about the consequences. How heroically they flung themselves into revolutionary war against British, never caring for their own life. This sort of Kshatriya, upsurge of Kshatriya, breaking out of Kshatriya spirit, suddenly an eruption of Kshatriya spirit could be found within 10 years of Vivekananda's giving call to Indians to rise up. So if same call can be repeatedly given to our young men, yes, history will repeat itself. Only the Kshatriya is sleeping. It is dormant in us. It is not dead. What is required is a rouse, a triggering that is required. And the easiest way, and the straight and the immediate way, the effective way, is to make our younger generation take to the study of Vivekananda in their own way. Miraculous things will take place. There was a coolie boy in our ashram. He never had sufficient to eat once in 3 days, did study in Kannada medium up to his graduation. Right in the first attempt, he passed his IPS because he came in touch with Vivekananda and I injected into him that Chhatra. He wanted to go for a menial job. He was a meritorious student. I said, nothing doing. Either IAS you are doing or you are contesting an election and becoming Prime Minister of India. Took it very seriously. I gave him some Vivekananda books, studied them properly, took up IAS examination, got through right in the first attempt. This is one expression of the Chhatra spirit that was in him. This is a Chhatra spirit only. Whenever you are aiming your attention at something which you had thought impossible to do, but now you feel you can definitely accomplish it. Remember, that is an expression of Chhatra period. So the expression of Chhatra should manifest itself in every field of national life. And our target groups must be the student groups and the younger generation. Every boy must aim at becoming CEO of a company and not becoming a software engineer. Everyone must aim at becoming Prime Minister, not at merely becoming anything less than that. So if we can lift up the confidence level of our younger generation and make them set their eyes on higher things in life, then the Chhatra that is dormant inside starts awakening and the true results will manifest themselves in a visible way.
Swamiji, from whatever you have told me so far, knowledge of this country and knowledge of this history is most important. This country's history is most important.
Yes.
So my humble question to you is, in the institutions run by the great Ramakrishna Mission, because I myself am a follower of Swami Vivekananda, I have effectively, Ramakrishna Mission in Hyderabad is one place that I visit every time I go, or even in Chennai for that matter. And every time I read his speech in Chicago, I'm somehow reminded of his voice. I don't know how he sounded, but I read it in his voice in my own head, and it rouses me no end. But the question that I'm asking myself is, in the current atmosphere where our history textbooks and curricula are completely against the history of Bharat and they don't show the true history of Bharat, how does Ramakrishna Mission and its institutions overcome this particular barrier? And how do you still present the history of this land to your students, to your products? How do you ensure that they come out with some degree of respect for this country and for its traditions? How do you do that?
There are so many hundreds and thousands of books available in vernacular as well as in English language, where the true history of India is perfectly reflected. In addition to Vivekananda's complete works, we also have got Swami Ranganathananda's works, where good deal of Indian history is presented in its truest perspective.
And
In
Swami
addition to
Ranganathananda has been cited by the Supreme Court. I have read judgments where they have cited Swami Ranganathananda.
wonderful, very great man. Vivekananda Reborn, I call him always. So in addition to that, from my own personal side, what I have been doing, we have been conducting youth conventions all over Karnataka. Every year, about 3 to 4 times, about 1,000 young men, college students mainly, they gather in a place and there will be topics for discussion. In all these topics, whenever we are delivering our speeches, invariably the greatness of India, achievement of India will be highlighted. And we go on saying, even now, you, the younger generations of India today, the contemporary younger generations, even now, even today, you have the same ability in you. But what is required is determination and effort. With effort and determination intact, rightly directed, and rightly hit. Remember, it can fetch you anything that you want. So with this sort of an enjoining, with this sort of an exhortation, at least a few people will become very much affected. So many people are there. So many youngsters are there. They all have changed their life. And from the pitiable condition that they were in to the most exalted condition that they had never dreamt of, they have lifted themselves. They have effected this transition. Here and there we see that wonderful, marvelous, metamorphical changes taking place. Of course, they are very stray. Only the individuals we are seeing. If we want to see such changes en masse, then the only remedy, the only way is that we have to introduce Vivekananda's rousing call into the textbooks that Indian students are exposed to. In our own way, in its own way, the Education Department of India should inject this rousing call of Vivekananda into every boy, every girl at high school level, and the process must continue for about 5-6 years up to the 12th grade. From 9th grade, in today's revised education system, I think there is what is called as 5 plus 3 and 4 plus 3. In that 5 plus 3 plus 4, at that level, during that 4-year period, 9th standard, 10th standard, 11th standard, 12th standard, there has to be a compulsory book bearing the caption, bearing the title Personality Development or Citizenship Awareness or Human Development, Science of Human Development. With that caption, there has to be a book. Vivekananda's exhortations will have to be compiled, and it should also contain the living illustrations of how, for example, this Kangana Rawat, Arunima Sinha, who had lost both the legs, her legs were cut and they were apart. They were apart. Both the legs were cut and they were apart. That lady later, she mustered so much courage that she climbed Mount Everest.
Yes.
Lady with no legs today has climbed Mount Everest. What a miracle. She says, Vivekananda did this miracle in me. So with that miracles serving as illustrations, in addition to the exhortations, if we can compile a book for 4 years continuously, 4 parts and 4 books, if our students can go through all these 4 books, and if examinations etc. can be conducted upon those books, and if they study these books with all the seriousness they do with physics or chemistry, then something will enter into their inner core, in their personality, and remarkable changes, tremendous attitudinal changes, metamorphical changes will take place in them, and we definitely see a greater citizen, a higher level citizen, a stronger citizen of India getting unfolded from the existing lot.
Swamiji, when the history of India is presented in all its truth and in all its honesty to the current generation, several students coming from non-Hindu backgrounds and non-dharmic backgrounds are bound to receive the same education, and they're bound to see certain aspects which can make them uncomfortable. How do you propose to address that situation? Because obviously certain uncomfortable truths have to be spoken when India's history is discussed, particularly the period of invasions, the period of colonization, the period of conversions, especially under the British and even before, forcible conversions, violent conversions and all that. And when we discuss the issue of partition and the history of partition of this country, we have to necessarily touch upon religion. So when all of this is presented before young, impressionable minds, one of the fears that I constantly hear whenever I give this check is that will this not actually lead to division, further hatred? Should we not forget all of this? How do you propose to address this? What are your thoughts on this? This is very important, Swamiji.
Remember, there is a truth and there is society. When Copernicus said, it is not the sun that is moving around the earth, it is earth that is moving around the sun, the then civilized world became very much disturbed, very much uncomfortable. What to do with that? When Heisenberg, a scientist that we come across from the quantum physics background, presented his uncertainty principle, Einstein himself became uncomfortable. Einstein did not allow Heisenberg to present uncertainty principle as long as he was alive. It was only after the death of Einstein that Heisenberg presented freely the uncertainty principle. You come from an engineering background and you can understand this. What to do? If you are not able to digest the truth, you can't help it. We cannot remold truth just because we have to tune ourselves with the needs of the society. If society and truth are wide in the two scale pans, then it is truth that should overweigh and not society. Society has to pay tribute to truth, and truth need not pay any tribute to society. It is their problem. History is history, and we are not telling any lie.
Right.
All sorts of nonsensical things that their forefathers have done, let them feel ashamed of. Why did they do it? If they feel so much ashamed to be a Muslim or a Christian, then it's up to him. I can't change the truth. Just because somebody feels hurt, I can't say 2 into 2 is equal to 55. 2 into 2 is equal to 4 only.
So one final question, Swamiji, and I will
Yeah.
close my questions with this. So
Yes.
Purusha Suktam is frequently cited in all places whenever the Varnashrama system is discussed or the Jati system is discussed, to show that Purusha Suktam is proof of the fact that Hinduism is fundamentally a slave-driven society where the Shudra is seen as the feet of Brahma or coming from the feet of Brahma, and therefore it shows that several segments of the society were effectively treated as inferior, and which is why there is a concept of higher caste and lower caste and Savarna and whatever it may be. So Purusha Suktam is constantly cited in this regard. I am not qualified to comment on that subject, but given your knowledge, could you please shed some light on what is your interpretation of the Purusha Suktam in this regard?
According to Purusha Suktam, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra came with the very birth of a human being. Observe human body. Brahmano asya mukhamasit. There is mukham, and that is Brahmana. Okay. Brahmano asya mukhamasit. Bahurajanyah krutaha. The hands, the bahus are the Kshatriya. Uru tadasya yadvaishyaha. My thighs are the Vaishya. Padbhyagum Shudru Ajayata. Feet are the Shudra. Feet is Shudra. This is Varna. This is not Jati. Sukta deals with Varna. It doesn't deal with Jati.
Okay.
Anyone who does what the Jnanendriyas do is a Brahmana.
Okay.
He may be a scheduled caste man, or he may be a Muslim even. He may be a Christian even. As long as he is engaging his head, he is very much interested in using the head. He is a Brahmana.
Okay.
Head is there at the top. Therefore, Brahmana is there at the top. People using head, not Brahmanas, are at the top. People using heads are always at the top. People using their limbs, their hands, they are a bit below. People that are using their, again, the thighs, etc., uruhu, they are a little bit below. And the whole system is being supported by the feet. Feet is there at the bottom. According to human structure, feet has to be at the bottom. Feet have to be at the bottom. The thighs have to be above the feet. And the hands will have to be above the thigh. And the head has to be at the top. No. Why head has to be at the top? Let head be at the bottom and the feet at the high, at the top. Feet can be at the top and head can be at the bottom. If human structure can be reformed, can be remodeled in such a way that head becomes the foot and foot becomes the head, then they can say whatever they want. As long as head is there at the top in the human structure, people using the head will always be at the top of the society. You need not call them Brahmana. Call them whatever you want. People using head are always at the top. People using the hands are a bit below. People using the thighs are a bit below. And people merely supporting all these three will always be at the bottom. That is the meaning. All the objection is there only for using the words Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, that's all. If I say head-oriented people are at the top, everybody will say yes. Everybody will nod his head. Head-oriented people, the work-oriented people, movement-oriented people, assistance-oriented people, they have their own positions. Well, it is acceptable to everyone. So therefore, problem is only with the terminology that we use. Our rationalists, their rationality is confined only to terminologies. Their rationalities cannot go beyond the terminology. They can't penetrate into the inner core of the concept. We need not bother much about that.
Swamiji, I'm really grateful for the patience with which you have answered all my questions. If I have showcased my ignorance with these questions, my sincere apologies, but I have learned a lot from your answers. And I'm really grateful, and I hope that members of the audience have learned this. And whenever the lockdown eases a bit and I get an opportunity to meet you, I hope I will have the good fortune of meeting you to discuss these issues in greater detail. With your kind consent, may I just proceed to address the audience for 15 minutes?
Yes, yes, I am very much eager to meet you. I have heard a lot about you, Deepak. Hello?
Grateful, Swamiji, grateful.
Yeah, I have heard a lot about you, especially when you championed, when you advocated the cause of royal family, towards whom I have got the highest respect. They preserved this, you see, the temple property even to this day intact. Any
Correct.
other king would have run away from India, taking all this property with him. But those great people, royal family, they preserved it. And even today, they count themselves custodians of that and not the owners of it.
Correct.
Such a great cause you have championed. And I was so happy to listen to the verdict of the Supreme Court. I was, in fact, very much eager to see you. I was very much eager to see. And let us look forward to the earliest opportunity to meet each other. Whenever you come to this side of India, pay a visit to my ashram. You are always extremely welcome. Extremely welcome.
Grateful, Swamiji. Grateful, Swamiji.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Shashi, now I'll proceed to address, and there's a reason why I started this interaction for the benefit of the audience. I initially had a couple of points to make. I wanted to talk about caste, religion, dharma, jati, and whatnot. But the fact is, lawyers with their knowledge of the constitution are incomplete people to discuss this particular issue, because you need to know history, you need to know the native understanding of jati, kula, varna. You need to understand that in India's vast history, since so many things have happened over the course of several thousand years, it is impossible to try and understand the role of caste, the function of caste, the status of caste, or the significance of caste using the current situation, simply because the current is not effectively a reflection of the past. The current is either a regression or an evolution from the past, but it cannot be used as the lens to understand the past in its entirety, particularly when our own versions of history and our own sources of history have so much of diversity and have so much of depth. It is impossible to speak on caste and religion without understanding Bharatiya history. That's one of the reasons that I decided to convert this monologue or this interaction, so to speak, as a dialogue with Swamiji, so that some of these aspects come out in front of the audience, so that they know that this is the depth that you need to effectively speak on these subjects. Because the loose talk with which we indulge in when it comes to caste and religion in public fora, in newspapers, in articles, in talk shows, and every other place, effectively shows that we have zero understanding of where we come from and what is the tradition of this particular land. So when we discuss the constitution, most people who have taken an anti-caste position or who believe that caste as a system must be completely destroyed never ask this simple question. If Babasaheb Ambedkar wrote this book called The Annihilation of Caste and was subsequently also a member of the drafting committee of the constitution, took an active role in the crafting of this book that we know as the constitution today, this legal instrument that we know as the constitution today, why is it that after abolishing untouchability and after abolishing or after providing for caste-based reservations, he never considered the concept of caste-based, or let's say caste abolition altogether? There was not a single proposal which came effectively from him, even after having experienced caste discrimination, to reject the concept of caste and to demolish the concept of caste, despite having written books on it. And there is a reason for it. As Swamiji rightly pointed out, as far as India's current understanding of caste is concerned, it is largely driven by how the Westerners and effectively how the Britishers saw it. Caste has been a fluid identity. Even if it is birth-based, it has been significantly fluid. And who occupies what caste and who occupies which profession is something that has changed from time to time. And socio-economic conditions of one particular group has not been same across history. Unfortunately, what has happened today in India is that we have decided to use caste as a monolithic identity or as an intransient identity. Once there is one particular identity that is given to you at the time of birth, there is no way that you can escape it, thanks to the current system, which effectively gives benefits and entitlements on the basis of birth-based caste identity. Therefore, my exhortation whenever I've spoken on this particular topic, and this is something that I've been doing for at least 3-4 years now, has been to request members of the audience, especially the young members of the legal fraternity, to not jump to the constitution for all knowledge, because the constitution is the product of history. It is the product of this country's civilization. It is the product of a certain phase in this country's civilization. And therefore, you will never be able to make sense of the country or its traditions without reading history, and without reading history from the proper source, from the right sources. Not books which have been written by people who've had fundamentally nothing but hatred and contempt and disgust for Bharatiya civilization. So you need to read the right sources of history. And one of the things that I have learned effectively in my formative years is reading books which are published by the Ramakrishna Mission, reading books authored by Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. I've read books written by great stalwarts such as Rajagopalachari and other, let's say, historians of India, including native historians written in non-English languages, in vernacular languages, and regional languages. It is important to first understand the context in which this document called the Constitution has been put together. And unless and until you read the history of this particular country, you will continue to mouth the same superficial, shallow nonsense that you hear on television on a daily basis, which does not do justice to the history of this land. We are not a 200-year-old country. We are not a 70-year-old country. We are not a 300-year-old country. We are not even a 2,000-year-old country. We have a recorded history, according to our sources, traditional sources, which goes at least to 7,000 to 2,000 years, going by the fact that a ceremony or a ritual that was perhaps performed in the time of Mahabharata continues to be performed in the same manner, the same language, the same tones, even today. That is the strength of this particular land. That is, it is a living civilization. That is the longevity and the continuity of this particular country's history. So unless and until lawyers who are interested in speaking on caste and religion take it upon themselves to understand the history of this particular country, it is impossible to have an informed discussion on caste, because we will cite random examples and we will use the present to color the past and to effectively load the future. It makes very little sense to approach this particular complex topic, history-driven topic, with blinkers and reading only the Constitution. Dr. Ambedkar is certainly an important stalwart and a giant who must be read and who must be understood when we read the history of caste and religion in this country. But Dr. Ambedkar is not enough. It is not enough to read him alone. Dr. Ambedkar alone. Dr. Ambedkar himself would have never wanted people to read only him. It is important to go much beyond him and read as many sources as possible to understand the broad canvas at which this particular country operates, to understand the sheer depth of our traditions. As someone who has represented causes like the Sabarimala movement and the Padmanabha Swami temple, I know for a fact that my own understanding of tradition, my own understanding of sampradaya, my own understanding of achara, my own understanding of custom has only evolved as I have participated more and more in such matters. Because what people don't get to see, I've been able to see personally firsthand when I've interacted with people, I've interacted with the stakeholders, and I've read the books. So my humble request is, as someone who spent 11 years in the profession, I don't think that's a long period, but for whatever it is worth, kindly do not approach the Constitution as a literal constitutionalist. The Constitution effectively is a socio-economic, politico-legal document. It's a huge document. And therefore, if you have to do justice to that particular document, have some historical awareness, have some civilizational awareness, and have some sense of understanding of the circumstances that you're dealing with. There is no way that anybody can dismiss the existence of caste discrimination or caste-based atrocities which are committed in different parts of the country. But you have to understand that strife and struggle are natural to human beings. And therefore, if your argument is caste is the reason for caste discrimination, then it could be equally argued that religion is the reason for religious discrimination. So let us do away with caste, let us do away with religion. Then what remains of the concept of identity? Is your only identity going to be that I'm a human being? What kind of vacuous nonsense is it? Do you really think that you are as evolved to say that my identity as a human being is sufficient? To say that I know better than my ancestors and that I know better than my predecessors is not an arrogant statement to make. But at least make that statement after having understood the positions taken by your ancestors and your predecessors in the circumstances that they lived in. India has seen a phase where, as Swamiji rightly points out, several dynasties and several traditions and several rituals trace their origins either to the pre-Mahabharata period or the post-Mahabharata period. Therefore, post the Mahabharata period, there has been a significant amount of churn in the Indian society, in the Bharatiya society, not the Indian society, but the Bharatiya civilization. Subsequent to that, you had a host of invasions, a host of migrations, and a host of colonizations. Each of that has left an impact on the Indian civilization for the better and for the worse. Therefore, to use one particular phase of Bharatiya history to paint its entire civilizational journey as fundamentally a casteist journey or a bigoted journey or a fascist journey, I'm sorry to say, it does not do justice to the length and of this country's history. So this is something that I've tried to impress upon youngsters for one reason, that the art of reading and the art of deep reading is dying. The art of listening is dying. We don't seem to have attention spans which go beyond 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and we can't seem to read beyond 800 words and 1000 words. And if we can't seem to have the ability to read non-fiction more than fiction today, with all such attention deficit disorders effectively plaguing this current generation, the level of public discourse, the level of debating, the level of knowledge, the level of depth is bound to be abysmal and is bound to be utterly shallow. And that is precisely why discussions at every level on caste and religion, even when it comes to constitutional frameworks, is utterly, according to me, uninformed, largely uninformed. There were several myths which effectively pervaded the public discourse and mainstream media, both during the Padmanabha Swami temple case hearings as well as during the Sabarimala hearings. But several aspects which the media will never inform you, you placed it before the court in terms of the nature of the tradition. Who are the stakeholders to the particular tradition? What is the concept of Brahmacharya? What is the concept of Naishtika Brahmacharya? I could have easily deviated into this entire topic by talking about Article 25, Article 26, Article 27, 28, 29, and 30, Article 17, 15. I could have done all of that. But it has no meaning. It has practically no consequence, and it will not register on you unless and until you understand what kind of knowledge-based information are you supposed to equip yourself with in order for you to approach subjects such as caste and religion, even when you're looking at it through the prism of the Constitution and within the four corners of the Constitution. Fundamentally, most lawyers believe that law is the be-all and end-all of everything. And lawyers fundamentally believe that the Constitution is everything, because they believe that their profession is the ultimate profession, and therefore every document that they read, especially the Constitution, is the only document that is worth reading. That is not the manner in which even the framers of the Constitution approach the Constitution. You must be in a position to speak on history. A lawyer who does not have some degree of civilizational awareness or historical awareness is less of a lawyer and is an incomplete lawyer, at least if he wants to speak on the subject of Constitution. Maybe for commercial laws or maybe for transactional laws and other forms of or other areas of practice, you can afford to not know history. But if you want to speak on caste, religion, and its nexus and their nexus with Constitution, you must read history. It is impossible to hope to have some degree of nuance to make some kind of an impact and to have an intelligent statement without reading history. The one thing that Swamiji has effectively demonstrated without any doubt, and I think it is a lesson for all of us, is that this is the extent of knowledge that people who populate our ashrams are equipped with and are blessed with and endowed with. So when we assume that people sitting in ashrams have no knowledge of modern Indian history, have no understanding of politics, have no understanding of society, I think Swamiji has effectively busted all those stereotypes and myths and shown us how little I know, how little perhaps others know, and how much there is to know before we speak on such complicated issues such as caste and religion. So I'm happy to take questions now because whatever I wanted to share with the audience, I put it by way of questions to Swamiji so that his responses effectively are captured for the benefit of the audience. I'm happy to take questions now. I think the session ends at about 7:30. The next 15 minutes, I will use it to answer questions.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. I am actually speechless as to say, I don't know what to say, because the interactive session that you and Swamiji held together and the way that you have tackled this entire topic has answered every question that our participants had put forth before us. And it has opened our eyes to know what we do not know and what we have to look into. So thank you so much.
In fact, credit for that goes to Shashi, because when Swamiji started speaking, I sent him a message immediately saying that Swamiji has presented us with a fantastic opportunity to convert this dialogue into, or rather this monologue into a dialogue, so that I'm in a position to ask questions. Because you see, obviously, I don't know as much as Swamiji knows. So the idea was to be able to showcase the wealth of knowledge that Swamiji has to present. So credit goes to Shashi for having given me the opportunity to change the format of this particular interaction a bit. My apologies to the members of the audience if this has caused a change in expectations. If at all there is any blame to be laid at anyone's doors, I'm the one to be blamed. The organizers are not to be blamed for this.
Sir, I say it yet again, it has been an absolute blessing for the interaction that has taken place and has fed our inquisitive mind. It's more than enough filled today, and has literally, because we had two documents that had questions and questions of what, where, how, when, and why does this even happen, and it has answered that and more. I do not have any questions for you, but if you would like to share something more, we would be glad to hear.
So one of the reasons that I raised that sensitive question about how do we deal with history, especially given that India is now the home of several Muslims and Christians and people who don't follow dharmic faiths, is for a different reason. See, unfortunately, when we discuss history, history is not a comfortable subject to deal with. It is not meant to make you feel good. It is not meant to make you happy. It is meant to teach you a few lessons. And why are these lessons important? And this is an example that I've given in multiple places. So if it hurts or offends people, so be it. I'm exercising my right to free speech. See, if you don't teach people, the current generation, the difference between caste and caste discrimination, and you don't tell them you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of caste, you don't treat people as inferior on the basis of caste, then the current generation will continue to make the same mistakes as their ancestors. Okay. Similarly, if you don't teach other aspects of Indian history where religion has played a central role, and religion has perhaps played a role in massacring people, in commission of genocides and whatnot, and you don't tell them that this is not to be repeated again, what kind of an example are you effectively giving them, and what kind of, let's say, lesson are you hoping that they will draw? So the importance of history, if it is relevant for the purposes of caste, it is equally important for the purposes of religion as well. Unfortunately, it has so happened that we have decided to not have these discussions for the fear of hurting people. You will hurt people if your intention is to hurt people and you're targeting them. But if you're discussing facts and you're discussing it in a calm tone, and you're saying this happened, this happened, this happened, and all of this must be presented so that it never happens again, which is the purpose of history, to ensure that good aspects are retained, but the worst aspects are never repeated. How will you know that you're not supposed to make a mistake unless and until you're told that you've committed such a mistake? Right? We live in an era when we have just seen the Bhumi Pujan of the Sri Ram Janambhoomi temple. Therefore, it is time that the Indian society started having these discussions without necessarily hurting people. None of these discussions happen in law campuses today, in law schools today, because these discussions are effectively stifled and snubbed because it is bound to hurt sentiments, apparently. Give people the credit of being mature so that you treat them as adults. If you're over 18 and you're in a position to vote, or if you're over 21 and you're in a position to marry, or whatever it may be, you must be in a position to hear the truth. If you run away from truth and you hope to have some kind of courage and independence, I'm sorry, I don't see how you can be credited with having an independent mind if you don't have the guts to face history, something that has happened and something that continues to happen. So my limited suggestion and humble request to people of the audience, especially the youngsters, is do not run away from history and kindly foster the spirit of open discussions, politically incorrect discussions, not safe discussions. If somebody has a certain position which goes against the grain of popular opinion, have the guts to hear him out. And if your brain can think of an argument to counter that particular argument. But to label people and to stop them from expressing their opinions, that is the latest fad that is that's effectively showing itself and demonstrating itself in law schools in several places, especially in law schools, in the legal fraternity. So my request to you would be, you can disagree with me on facts, you can disagree with me on history, but you certainly can't disagree with me on the value of history and the need to understand history in as objective a manner as possible. If uncomfortable lessons and bitter lessons are the product of reading history, then as Swamiji rightly points out, the society must show the maturity and the guts to accept those lessons. Merely because the medicine happens to be bitter, are you going to spit it out? You can sugarcoat it, but at the end of the day, the medicine is going to have an impact. And you can't stop that particular impact by having, let's say, truckloads of sugar. That's not how it works, right? So my only limited suggestion, the purpose of this entire discussion was not to showcase my knowledge of any particular subject, but to basically say, if you have to be an independent-minded lawyer, especially if you wish to practice constitutional law, guts, honesty, and integrity are the three central requirements. If you have guts, honesty, and integrity, then you're ready for knowledge. If you're ready for knowledge, you're ready for responsibility. That is effectively how it is supposed to function. That is all I have to say. I have nothing more to say.
Thank you, sir. There has been one question from the participant right now. It's actually apart from this subject. Why did you choose law after BE?
If I'd actually collected a rupee from every person who's asked me this, so just for the benefit of the audience, I have shared this particular, in fact, I've discussed this in several platforms. In fact, there is an interview of mine on this portal called Super Lawyer, and I was part of Sai Krishnan Associates in 2014 or 2015. You can read that. The short answer is this. I was not a failed engineer. I loved engineering. I took engineering with a lot of passion. I took it up. I wanted to pursue a master's in aerospace engineering because my role model, one of them was certainly actually Abdul Kalam. And I wanted to join the Indian defense organizations to effectively contribute there. It just so happened that in the fifth semester of engineering, I decided to switch my streams altogether for the simple reason that I felt that my skill sets are better put to use in a profession that allows me to engage with members of the public. And there is no point in having an opinion without information, because every idiot can have an opinion. That doesn't make it an informed opinion or an opinion worth listening to. So I wanted to equip myself with some skill sets, some kind of knowledge. And since I come from a low middle class family, I did not have the benefit of exposure, because if I had the benefit of exposure, perhaps I would have taken up law even before. But even then, law wouldn't have been an option because law has been traditionally seen as the profession of the rich, or at least the upper middle class. So once I was done with engineering, I decided to take up law. And I latched onto the profession with the passion of a new convert. And I decided to surrender and submit myself to the particular profession. And I thank all the gods, because I'm a polytheist, I'm not a monotheist. I thank all the gods for giving me the, let's say, the wisdom to choose this particular profession at the right time, and for enabling this at the right time. Because I think I finally landed in a profession where it's perhaps the right fit, and therefore I enjoy each day in this profession. Every opportunity that comes my way teaches me something new, and I get to be part of such brilliant discussions. I get to share space with eminent people like Swamiji. So it gives me an opportunity to participate in public discourse, not as a random fellow who speaks like a motor mouth without any knowledge, because it's important to have some degree of humility to know what you know and what you don't know, When you don't know something, you're supposed to sit at somebody's feet and learn. That has been my biggest lesson as far as law is concerned. I've learned from so many people. So that's been the reason for the switch. The ultimate goal is to contribute to public discourse and to elevate the nature of public discourse and have an honest discussion. So regardless of what people think of me, I continue to hold my opinions and I state my opinions bluntly. But without being rude, I effectively say this is my position for so reason. You take it or you leave it, I don't care.
Thank you, sir. I do have one more question.
Yeah.
What advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
My 20-year-old self. So I finished engineering at the age of 19 and a half, 20. So my advice to the 20-year-old self when I stepped into law school, I love jurisprudence and I paid a lot of attention to jurisprudence. But the one thing that I could have perhaps done more is to read up more on economics. So a lawyer, according to me, must be a fairly decent student of history, politics, and economics. All three go hand in hand. And the degree that I chose, the law school that I chose, which is the IIT Kharagpur Law School, was specifically designed in such a way that it was meant for engineers. I wish it had a greater, let's say, smattering of economics. That would have equipped me better. And the other thing that perhaps I would have told my 20-year-old self is not to be pessimistic. I'm fundamentally an optimist, but the nature of public discourse was such that anyone holding my kind of views was effectively ostracized or isolated. I'm grateful and I'm to live in a generation where my point of view at least has some audience and I'm able to speak and interact with people who are interested in listening to what I have to say. So I think optimism is the moral of my story. Never lose hope, never lose courage, and stand by your guns. Stick to your position.
Thank you, sir, for clearing our doubts and more. Now I would like to request my friend Sagar to convey the vote of thanks.
Hello. Good evening to all of you. It is my great privilege to propose vote of thanks on behalf of S3 team. First of all, I would like to thank Parama Pujaniya Srimad Swami Nirbhayananda Saraswati ji for his inaugural talk and blessings. I would like to thank today's our guest, senior advocate, who represented Lord Ayyappa himself in Shabrimala case, Sri J. Sai Deepat sir, for his valuable time.
Just to clarify, there are other advocates here. I'm not a senior advocate.
Okay, sir. And very insightful words, sir.
Hello.
Sir, really, we enjoyed your conversation with Swamiji. It gave us many insights on religious aspects, sir. We learned a lot through your dialogue, sir. And also, I thank Bastar sir, Basu sir, and Anup sir for their kind support. Finally, I thank H3 team and all the participants who made this event very successful. Thank you all from my bottom of heart. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sagar. Once again, thank you everyone for your participation and cooperation. Stay safe and take care.